Of course, debates are won by strategy and arguments, but there is sometimes, but storytelling and framing are also very important in debating. You want to be the team that the judge wants to make win, right? You want to be the team that sounds very reasonable, and you want to be the moral team actually in the round. And so there are certain strategies you can use to steal the moral high ground. Part of it is how you use language, but also part of it is your choice of arguments, right? So, what do you do if you are facing a topic where it is about granting rights or benefits to vulnerable populations? So, the proposition side is granting people, land or money or affirmative action. And then you are the team that has to oppose that, right? Or what if you have to defend a position that is quite unpopular, like military invasion or torture? So it's clearly like the bad guy position in the debate. What do you do? So I have some tips and strategies, but I also want this to be interactive. So I'll give you some examples of those motions, and then we'll do a workshop as a group. I think the first important thing is to acknowledge the concerns and the intentions. So I think it's important for you to acknowledge that you are slightly the bad guys. You should yes, we understand there's a problem. But at the same time, this decision is incredibly misguided. It makes things worse, or it doesn't solve the problem and then makes it harder to solve it later on, right? So I think it's important to frame it immediately as, look, we're not evil, but we are thinking about this more carefully. And a policy like that has unintended consequences. Even if it's not your intention that bad things will happen, and let me tell you why. Or kind of basically you don't quite understand that even if you have a good intention for your model or your policy, these intentions are not going to be achieved. So, for example, let's talk about the minimum wage, right? You have a proposition team that says the minimum wage is important. We should have a minimum wage that we impose on companies, because if we don't have this, companies have too much power over their workers, disproportionate power over them. If a worker is unhappy with the salary, the company can just let them go and find someone else. And because you have more workers than jobs, then the company will always have a leverage over their workers, and they can push people. They can, it's a race to the bottom, and you you can't really lobby for higher wages. But this is a problem because the state does so many things for businesses. It enforces contracts, it enforces property rights, it gives you tax breaks sometimes. That it is the duty of businesses, therefore, to ensure. The only reason we do this is to ensure that people are taken care of, that they earn a living wage, right? Otherwise, then why would we are effectively subsidizing businesses if we don't require them to pay the minimum wage? Sounds quite compelling, right? It also might just be correct. But let's say you had to oppose this. What are you going to say? Yeah.
I mean, something blatantly liberal, but maybe make it look not as liberal or not as bad.
Sure.
So I think the main advance towards this topic that a liberal would have is something in the lines of this thing causes production costs to go up, and then production is really expensive, and now these people, of course, now they have a minimum wage, but now they have to pay $50 or something for a can of tuna. So really, this wage doesn't really work for them, and also these companies don't hire as many people anymore. So you have more unemployed people and higher prices, and people are dying. That's the liberal approach.
Okay.
Also, to make it comparatively, it is better to have less workers with more benefits social status and healthcare and everything, and sacrificing this for more workers it kind of sounds great in terms of quantity, but not in quality. And use it comparatively.
Very good. So you go look. It drives prices up, which hurts consumers. Who are the most price-sensitive consumers? The poor. So you screw them over. That's one. Two, companies are going to be less likely to hire as many people now because the cost of hiring per worker is a lot higher. Then you ask, which workers do you think are likely to be disenfranchised by this. It is likely to be the lower skilled workers, or the workers with less experience, or with no college education, or minorities, or women, right? And these are precisely the kinds of vulnerable workers you were trying to protect with a minimum wage law, but who will be disenfranchised by this law first. So this is a policy that, while it has good intentions, misses the target, right? I mean, of course, then there's a response from the other side too, but then you now have a clear direction of where you're going. You don't have to be arguing against minorities and low-skilled workers. In fact, you are now suddenly their defender, right?
Yes.
Okay. I feel like such an evil person for giving this workshop, but you kind of like needed to win things. Now, what if the model is, indigenous people have been historically oppressed by the government. Their land was seized, there's been historical discrimination against them, their legal systems and their dispute resolution mechanisms have been completely ignored, and instead we just imposed like a different legal order on them, a different property rights system, a different criminal justice system. And so in order to give back, like in order to address these historical reparations, we should give them financial compensation. So we need to give significant amounts of money to indigenous communities. Respond?
Like, oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe that money is not exactly the way to do it, because they probably would not spend it in a way that would be like good for them, you know, because of the necessities we have created for them. Because now that they've seen like our world where we have like chocolate and stuff and things that maybe they think they need nowadays, but they actually don't, they might spend all of this money in things that are not good for them. And actually what we should do is take responsibility for introducing them to this world of like consumerism and stuff, and I don't know, spend this money in education and in like hospitals over there.
So there are seeds there. Basically, you're concerned that the money is not going to have the achieve that was intended. It would actually result in empowerment. Yeah.
Actually, the problem with the motion is how like there has been a big assimilation by the West from this like indigenous people. So by giving them money, like the only thing that we're doing is further like symbolically and also materially like sucking them inside or assimilating them inside our culture, instead of giving them like actual resources that they can use to become successful outside of the Western system itself.
Fair.
the comparative is like a short-term response to the historical debt versus like a structural reform.
Yep.
When a state gives them money, they create the narrative that, oh, we are helping poor people, we are helping indigenous people. That means that further actions towards like trying to restore equality are likely to be less powerful, or the state might discontinue them as they are already giving them the answer.
It is, yeah.
Also, you can run like analysis, like in some post, in these countries where used to be like from colonies or whatever. I think it's quite clear that indigenous people suffer from several narratives that are imposed by the media or by conservative groups, which make them seem like dependable or like stopping progress in countries. Something like it's really strong in Peru and has affected the image and the symbolism of these indigenous cultures. And by running this measure, you're actually enforcing and empowering these narratives and giving more realistic approach for conservative parties to actually run against them in several, like in politics or in just the media.
So what you're saying is the first step in achieving the conclusion that you said, right? Which is basically, this is a question of political capital, right? We have very limited political capital, unfortunately, to make a real difference and to compensate for historical injustices. Why is money not the answer? So then you give the reasons that we got from them both, right? One, there isn't really a culture of entrepreneurship in these communities necessarily. Sometimes accountability mechanisms, like the hierarchy of these communities, isn't even like very democratic. You must be very careful about how you explain this so that you don't sound racist, right? But there is data that shows that women are quite marginalized in a lot of these communities. Like, what is your structure for ensuring that the money will trickle down inclusively, I guess, is a question you can ask. but also even if it does, it's very short term. Like, many people struggle with financial literacy across the board, right? Like, how learning how to invest, where to invest, what to do with this money. Not everyone has that entrepreneurial sense or even the access to the networks and the skills to roll the money. So you're likely to burn through this money really quickly, right? And in ways potentially that are very consumerist and dangerous. Plus the assumption that they want money is not even clear, right? So what you say. Then you add this bit, which says, but once you've given this, you are buying off society's conscience, essentially, right? They are like, the moral incentive has now been converted to a financial incentive, we're done. We've already repaid our debt, don't you dare ask for more after. Why is this the more likely outcome? Insert what he said, which is we're already predisposed to think of them as backward and as, dependent and as mendicant and all of that, right? So what is the likely outcome here? So obviously you don't deny the benefit of money, right? Like you'll be like, there might be some short-term boost here, obviously, but the trade-off here is in the long term. It's going to be so much harder to argue for more structural, reparations or reforms like land, access to education, genuine political representation, right? And why these are better. So that might be a way you approach that debate. The other way is to just say they deserve nothing. But that might be a bit difficult. That might be a bit difficult.
I have a question. How common is for a team making wars to escape the liberal bubble and to present a conservative argument?
It's not as uncommon as you think. Like, it actually does happen. And they just whine all the time about how they're discriminated against, but they're not. Like, the default paradigm in worlds is the free market argument. Like, it is very hard to argue against the free market. I mean, so it's hard for social conservatives to succeed in debating. But I don't know if that is because we are discriminatory against them or because it is genuinely difficult to intellectually and rigorously defend homophobia or
Don't try.
or early marriage, right? So perhaps in that sense, yes. But I am not persuaded that Worlds is biased towards
Fiscal conservatism.
yeah, it is biased towards, exactly, as in, the winning argument, I think, in most economic debates is free market is great, right? So I struggle. So I don't think it's as rare as they whine about. It's a small minority of angry people who are probably just bad debaters. Anyway, next. All right.
Yeah.
So we've identified two ways, right? Bleeding hearts economic policies, there are unintended consequences here that you don't realize. And then second, if it's like compensation for historical injustice, you can talk about political capital and what is most sustainable to do. Are you familiar, this is just a side note, are you familiar with the research they did on the Tel Aviv daycare center where they find parents for lateness?
That's economics, right?
Yeah. This is less directly related to this, but I think it's useful to keep in mind in terms of responding to things that sound good immediately, and you're like, wait, actually that's too good to be true, that's not how it'll play out. So what happened there was, there's a daycare center in Tel Aviv, parents drop off their kids, right? They're supposed to come and pick up their kids at 4 p.m. because daycare center will close, and the staff have their own lives. Parents are always late. So daycare center is like, fuck this shit. We are going to now fine you. I forget what the fine was. And we're gonna fine you X amount for every 30 minutes that you were late. Guess what happened?
They all start coming right in time.
Or, that's not what happened.
No. They just didn't take the children.
No?
Yeah.
They just got fined?
They extended the
They-
schedule.
No?
They were late, more late.
Yes! More parents came late. You know why? Because the moral guilt
Yeah.
has been replaced by a fee.
Oh.
So you're just like, oh, okay, so if I pay for this, then it's fine.
Yeah.
Right? So I will just then treat it as an additional fee. So if I was paying for $25 a day, not 27, but hey, that means I have an extra hour that I can stay at work, right? So these things don't always play out in the way they're intended. And I think that's a skill you need to learn. Like if something sounds too good to be true and too obvious, ask yourself, is it actually? If you have to argue against it, right? Okay, that was a random side example. It was not on my notes. Okay, so the next thing we might be able to say is, here, I'll give you another example, you brainstorm this. mandatory reporting of third parties like doctors for domestic violence. Argument. You're a doctor, you have a patient who you suspect is being victimized with domestic violence. You are the only person who probably has access to this information because you have access to the medical records, and you can assess based on a number of visits that this person is indeed suffering from domestic violence. This is an urgent situation because a lot of his cases can escalate really quickly. They're life-threatening. You must have a duty to report it to law enforcement so that they can intervene right away. Because if you don't report, this person can die. What is the op?
It's like an actor.
Yeah.
It can be an actor, it can also just be doctors should, or this house would require doctors to. Yeah.
Doctors is easier to defend, like, because instead of, if it's not an actor motion, I'd say that then the people who are suffering from violence or domestic violence just would not go to the doctor, and that's a lot worse for them.
Okay.
There's an important clarification, that is that normally the cases of like domestic violence are constant. Like people who suffer it are not like hit once or twice, they're hit multiple times.
Yeah.
And that means that if someone goes there, it's probably because in their homes they like suffer this like structurally.
Yeah.
So if the person who is hitting them knows that if they will go and report them, they are more likely to be like even more authoritarian, even more controlling to these people.
Yeah. So there you go. I think you're like, on face, this sounds like a, you were gonna say?
I think that like that's like the hard case, obviously.
Yeah.
But there's also like a side case to it, which I think revolves more around the particularities of what being a doctor like involves. Such as like ethics and like all this about like how being a doctor pans out in the real world, like what kind of like commitments you have towards your work. I know nothing about it,
but that works both ways, right?
Yes.
So one side says you have a commitment to uphold confidentiality, and the other side says, but when an actual crime is being committed and your patient's life is in danger, you have a duty to alert the authority. So I think this broad premise of medical ethics, each side will have their own narrative of what medical ethics should look like.
Yes.
And
I think you can work it, I mean, what I have been explaining about the backlash with an analogy, with comparing like these doctors' ability to have confidence within, for example, in Catholic Church with priests. And I mean, thinking about the potential abuser, the only reason why they lead, I don't know, their partner to go to a church, or they go to a church and they confess their crimes, is because they are completely certain that they will never be discovered because priests will never tell. So the same thing happens with doctors and their confidence. So once this narrative of confidence is broken, it's more likely that these people will completely, like they say, restrain the chances of these people going to get help. And doctors can make a lot more help in more cases by trying to heal these people and offering ways to escape than to actually denounce the issue by the police or whatever.
So I think op goes, look, you might actually alienate the stakeholder that you're trying to help, because they'll be less likely to seek medical help on their own, or they won't be allowed to by their partners, which is even more dangerous, right?
Exactly.
And doctors, in some cases there's really nothing you can do on a doctor level, but in other cases, at least if you build some trust with the doctor, and they feel a sense of safety around the doctor, it becomes easier for the doctor to drop hints like, this is where you can get help, or like provide like more helpful suggestions as opposed to being seen as a threat themselves. I mean, on prop you can also be like, look, it becomes easier, like patients are more likely to, some patients who are in dire health but don't know where to turn to, knowing this, are more likely to go to the doctor in hopes of detection happening so that their lives can be saved. Like, because otherwise if they think the doctor is not allowed to report, then they won't bring it up. I mean, I think there's a back and forth here. I personally think it's mostly hard on prop, but in the tournaments that it's been set, it's been fairly balanced. Okay, next. What about policies like affirmative action? So this one is a fairly basic debate, but I want to look at I want to look at more nuanced and sophisticated responses. So, affirmative action for women in corporate boards, or affirmative action for women in parliament. You know the basic of the arguments, right? Like, oh, we do have qualified individuals, but they are excluded from the system because of historical perceptions that, you know, women are weak leaders or unqualified, and they don't have access to the networks and economic capital that males do to successfully put together candidacy or to ingratiate themselves, I guess, to the powers. Like, you don't belong to the same fraternities. You don't have the same like friendship networks. So perception plus actual like access to resources don't exist. So women are excluded even if they are qualified, right? Thus, we create space for women with reserved seats, and in these seats, women will be able to demonstrate their competence. We normalize the idea that women are qualified and people will more organically vote for them later on. That's your pro, plus many other things. What do you say on that? Yeah.
Kind of like the same thing. Like, this is too good to be true. Like,
Yeah.
like if you like impose this policy on people, like just on like basic nature, and also like the way society responds to like really strong structural changes, like that happen in a minute or so, instead of like these women like arriving and proposing policy and then like giving really good policy and like being respected for it, and also like getting like the social prestige that politics like has constructed around men in the status quo. I think that it is arguable that maybe it would be the exact opposite, which would be that all of the women in Congress would be just overlooked regardless of whatever they do, and it would be on the like basic principle that, well, maybe these women like didn't even deserve to be here. Like, why am I going to even look at them if they're just here because there's like a space for them? Like, I think that's like the normal response of like a conservative society. I would guess.
So you're likely to dismiss them and not take them seriously? Yeah.
Something that I believe could be said. Well, I mean, it also depends on the context. Because if we're like, I don't know, in the US, we probably do have like people that have had the education and stuff, but let's say we're in a really oppressive country, then what could happen is that we may have the same potential, but I think something that Op could say is like, but the thing is they are not the most qualified, not because they don't have the potential to be, but because of the way they have been socialized and the education opportunities they have had and the Pygmalion effect and all these kinds of things. So maybe what we should do instead of like reserving these seats is like having them as, I don't know if assessors is a word, but like have the qualified individual be in the positions of power and have these people that are oppressed like help them and tell them what their issues are, and then the people that have had the education and the people that are actually qualified and know how to come up with like good problem solving skills, then they should do it because, I don't know, meritocracy, like.
So what would your alternative world be like? Is it more organic change? As in you're like...
I mean, I think what Op would be saying is that it's not exactly an organic change, but what is happening is that these people who are oppressed, the issues they have are being tackled because these people that are in charge have the problem solving skills. But so like it's a requirement.
Okay, but that's rebutting a different argument, because there is an argument in favor of affirmative action that says women are better able to represent women's issues, to which you can say that's not necessarily true, because male politicians do have an incentive to attract female participation, right? But that's a different argument though. What about the argument of just qualified women being excluded structurally? Yeah.
I think you need to run a framing about how losing is always better in terms of the message you give, but also how you need to, for example, in politics, how you need to start like getting into this game of trade-offs and negotiations that only come when you have the incentive of winning and to getting to have a majority, for example, of votes.
Okay.
So I believe, we're having like direct agency if we put women in parliament, or we like make it easier for them to get there. But we are taking away the indirect agency, that is like getting into hard negotiations, that is like running a better political statement, like what you were saying. And also, I mean, probably they will get there faster and easier, but without this previous experience that is what really matters in politics, for example.
what if I said to you, but they will have to do that anyway, because women will have to run against other women at the very least. So there, it is still quite competitive and will still involve convincing a party that you are the woman they must field.
I
Yeah.
think that's still not that comparative because the real issue is how you negotiate and how you work within like the main elites of political parties, and in order to do so, you might get this only when you're running against a man, or when you need to get like more male voters.
Okay.
Or this will not be. It is exclusive of a non-affirmative.
Okay, so you're gonna say, look, your position, you're not coming in from a position of strength. In parliament, it is less likely for your bills to get backed because people don't feel like you have electoral impact behind you. So you're not gonna take taken seriously. I'm less certain about like this ability to negotiate thing, but I think you can prove it with those things, right? So your alternative world is, in a way, it is better to invest in women prior to the election, not at the point of the election, right? So fine, if progressive movements, are you familiar with Emily's List? It's like a progressive org that funds female candidates. Or, so these are the kinds of interventions we want, but not interventions at the point of locking in their seats, right? Because then that would include what you want. Anyone else? There's still an argument that's quite untouched, but anyone else? Does anyone else have anything here? Remember, if anyone here attended the feminism workshop, think intersectionally. If you have affirmative action for women in parliament or corporate boards, yes.
You say the problems of all the women are like the same.
Yeah. So which kinds of women are likely to be empowered in these situations?
White, boys.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. It's likely to empower elite women who weren't that far away from getting paths to power anyway. You cannot assume that women in corporate boards, especially when they are desperate to prove themselves because they're facing a lot of doubt from people who think that they just got there by virtue of affirmative action, right? They are not going to champion risky causes like women's rights. I don't think if you had a woman who is promoted to the board by virtue of affirmative action, her first argument is going to be, let's extend parental leave. I don't think that's what's going to happen, right? In fact, you have an incentive to be more conservative, to prove your worth to the company, or to prove your loyalty to a party. You will not break the party line in an election. Parties are going to pick the more conservative women as well, right? This is not true all the time. It's not quite true in Rwanda, which is the best example for affirmative action working, but it definitely is true in many parts of the Middle East. So when Egypt had affirmative action for women in parliament, it was the wives and the daughters of the elite males who got the seats. And the same is true in corporate settings. And then there's a political capital argument too, right? Would you rather empower women at the top end, the Sheryl Sandbergs of Facebook, to get seats in the corporate board, or would you rather a more class-based policy or even like intervene at the bottom end where you have more vulnerable, like less elite women getting access to these things? Because once you have the numbers there, you have the veneer of legitimacy. You're like, now we are gender equal. Look, woman, but actually white, wealthy woman, right? So that is a thing, I guess, to think about. And it's hard to run in a debate unless you think about it very carefully and you have one or two powerful examples. But the moment you have those examples, though, I think it really does cast doubt on this idea that the best way to gender equality is reserving seats. All right, let's not dwell too much on specific examples so we can do a workshop. What about a situation where you are granting rights to groups of people even when there is no like strong social consensus behind it? So Roe versus Wade, judicial activism, right? The courts were like, we will interpret the laws quite liberally to say that women have rights over their bodies, even if this wasn't a popular move. And as a result, then women are protected and lives are saved, and this is a great thing. How would you oppose? Yeah.
Okay, first you have to frame like the impacts in the short term and not the most important thing is
Sure.
right? Because of course perhaps have the impact of we're saving lives. It's quite hard to defend lives and not I think you are not have to save all the time. So you have to prove in some way that the long-term impacts are way worse.
Okay, then what would you say about the long term? Why is this a bad idea in the long term?
Can you repeat the motion? Like
So, I guess you say, let's say, support judicial activism in favor of progressive causes. So this is when judges don't just, so it's the whole Scalia versus Ruth Bader Ginsburg debate, right? This is when, well actually, this is more than Ruth. Because it's like, judges are like, no, we're not just gonna take a very literal interpretation of the laws. We will read it in light of like, newer understandings of human rights. And in this case, we kind of interpreted it as abortion is allowed, even if that's not like, if you read a close reading of the lines of the law that wasn't allowed, yeah.
I think you need to compare how, for example, referendums or quotas or like national elections, or including these kind of questions that happen, for example, with marijuana in California, are much harder to get, but also much harder to take away once they have been proved. For example, it is much harder that an abortion law that has been passed via referendum to be taken away because you consider that this is the will of the majority of the people.
Okay.
And for example, it is very easy to attack Roe versus Wade because it was a decision of 4 or 5 liberal judges. Like they have been doing in Alabama and other countries nowadays with abortion laws. Because the argument they run is this is not the will of the people. This is just the idea of the white elite financed by George Soros or whatever.
So I think you say, look, for any social change to be seen as legitimate and to be durable, right, to last and to be respected, you need buy-in. You need a significant amount of buy-in from society, a sense of ownership over the decision, which didn't quite exist for Roe versus Wade, which then makes it very vulnerable to the whims of changing administrations, right? And as we've seen, there has been a rollback in abortion rights significantly in the US, partly because of this perception that, you know, this is just imposed on us by like individuals rather than the social will. And I guess you can apply this to cases where we are talking about like broader rights for minorities where there is to it, because you can say that unless there's a meaningful ownership and buy-in, you might just be endangering them later on, and the risk of backsliding is really, really huge. I mean, that's a more sophisticated way of making a backlash argument, right? But I do think that there's a strong prop here as well, which is like, in the absence of social acceptance, the government is an actor that can normalize certain values because it is seen as an authority. There will be resistance, that's true, but there will always be resistance. But you speed it up if you like throw the full weight of the state behind it. But this is like the whole top-down model of change. If it's not like, if there's no massive buy-in, what are the consequences? All I'm saying is that there's a debate. That you don't just drop dead on op and be like, that sounds like a good idea. Like you hear a response, right? Okay, let me find other examples. Otherwise, we can just go through our chart. But one sec. If you have to do, this is just a tip, right? If you have to undertake a really extreme solution, like invading a country, or I don't know, chemically castrating pedophiles or something like that, which, you know, are really should be a bit harder to prove than they are. I think one good thing you can do is to frame it as kind of like a last resort and as very proportionate. So if you ask me in a debate that if you ask me to defend this house would invade North Korea, the first thing I would do is I'd ask myself, what is op going to defend? So Julio gave an entire lecture on counter models, right? Obviously, a smart op is not going to say, leave them alone, let them play with their nukes. Like, obviously, a smart op is going to go constructive engagement, right? At which point, you want to preempt that, and you'd be like, we have had 3 decades of constructive engagement. Here are all the things that have happened. This is why this is not an actor that we can trust when we negotiate with them, not negotiating in good faith. Give examples historically of talks breaking down or of agreements not being honored. And that's why we need invasion, right? So one way I think when you see a motion and you're like, holy fuck, am I really being asked to defend that? Is to explain why more reasonable measures have been taken and have failed or cannot be taken, and thus this is necessary. So you kind of have to think like op and then go back to being prop. Not always, I mean, it's not always successful, but I think it helps mitigate the proportionality questions, right? Okay, let's do an exercise. Let's do one, and I think let's just do one so we can do a round, no? This house would torture suspected terrorists to extract information.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear.
Torture suspected terrorists to extract information.
I think the thing that the U.S. does a lot is that it is like very trigger happy about this. Usually, they would consider like pretty much any person that is like brown and in the Middle East, like a suspect of
Yeah.
terrorism.
Yeah.
So I think that it's kind of like you have a bunch of like wrongful conviction and
Yes.
also like a bunch of like wrongful or unnecessary suffering
Yes.
for a like really like if you characterize it in the proper way, a very marginal impact.
Indeed. So on prop, you have to be prop though. In prop,
Yeah.
you have to do some model work here, right?
How to torture. That's the
So before we go to how to torture, like what model work, preemptive stuff will you put in?
It will be to really specific suspects who have been, like, you have like more than just a 50-50
Yeah.
idea of probability of criminality, like maybe 70 to 30, and like not every single member of the organization, but the ones who have the potential to give like essential information, maybe.
Yeah. So I think you might want to say, look, we have to, the police have to make a case to the judges that based on a triangulation of evidence, so you've looked at evidence, you have some leads, that you might be able to extract valuable information from the suspect. Like there's plausible reason for why you're doing this. The judge has to approve the warrant, and you need to have medical professionals present as it is happening. This doesn't, obviously these are open to attack by OP, right? But at least they are forced to spend time on it, and you protect yourself a little bit. And then you can say you will not completely rely, obviously, on the information you get from torture, because sometimes it isn't reliable, sometimes it is. You will obviously, this is just like a tool in a toolbox, like it's part of assembling a bigger picture of what's happening. And then how would you, so you did a lot of defensive work there already, but none of that is still argumentative, right? A lot of that is pre-argumentative defensive work and modeling. But that's important to your case, so you don't neglect that stuff. You're done with that, now how would you, maybe let's brainstorm one or two arguments for why this is justified.
A very important framing is that in a world where you get like important information that translates directly to lives, or at least the ability to helping people. Like, for example, if you are in 2004 and you capture an Al-Qaeda leader, or someone like that is at least like has information about what are we going to do, suicide bombs, etc.
Yeah.
Like the ability to preemptively take action against that is extremely important. Like in like the number of lives you can save versus the trade-off that you are torturing.
So your utilitarian calculus plus urgency. Yeah.
Maybe I don't know if this works for both, but I will make two special comparatives. First about proportionality, and second one about accountability.
Okay.
Within proportionality, you need to explain how, even if it's not plausible, but you also give mechanisms to explain how it's very plausible, that the potential harms that will be like a consequence of this, like terrorist attacks or whatever, are that hard or that terrible that it actually makes it legitimate to use some harm to attack this person in general. Like in terms of proportionality, even if it's not that plausible, as you are actually torturing the person, how harm it is kind of makes it balanced. And the second one about accountability. I mean, you can also argue that terrorists are not, should not be that accountable for their actions, because sometimes they are being like biased and ideologized and whatever, but still they have more agency towards what they're doing than the potential victims.
Yeah.
So in comparison of agency and accountability, they should suffer a little bit more than these victims.
Then the next question is, why is torture necessary though? Like, why can't you just have normal interrogation?
I mean, I think it kind of goes on the same line that Mauricio already mentioned about how these people are very ideologized and
Excellent.
also already like previously biased and culturally like conditioned to follow like certain set of rules. That I think that the only way that you break with like most of the ideology that has been imposed upon these people by like certain groups is by putting them on like survival instinct.
Yeah.
So when people are like on previous steps or like really short previous steps to death,
that's when like
Okay.
all of this
Yeah.
agility like kind of succumbs and they start like giving information.
So this is where, remember what I said earlier, what is the next best thing that OP is going to say? And you need to preempt that in your analysis already. OP here will say, why can't you just use standard interrogation techniques? Why can't you offer them amnesty? Like, why must you like torture them? At which point you were like, terrorists are not like ordinary criminals, they're not like ordinary bank robbers, right? They receive strong psychological training and ideological indoctrination that, and in fact, like in some cases, they have practiced torture actually to see that they don't break, and they're mentally tough, and regular interrogation techniques don't work on them. So obviously we'll try those first, but if they don't work, what are you going to do, OP? Right? And then put OP on the defensive. Obviously OP can answer, but then you and Prop have some moral basis to stand on. Okay. We could do the OP case, but I also do think the OP case is very obvious, which is that this is policy that's very prone to abuse. The information you get is not going to be valuable. They will lie or mislead you. Or they might not have information because terror cells operate in very secretive and insular ways. They limit the amount of information each person has, and the information gets dated really, really fast, right? Like, this human's arrested, Bin Laden moves right away. So you don't really get it from them. If you allow the police to torture, and I think this is when you respond to too good to be true stuff from the other side. Whenever a team has like a great model, which is like, we will have levels of accountability, we will go through judges, we will go through doctors. I think your response on OP is, yeah, but who is making the case to the judge? The cops. So if the cops want to torture, they get to, they get to make up a case to persuade the judge. And the judge won't know any better because they're not an investigator, right? But also, if you allow them to torture, it is not true that they will use low-level, interrogation techniques first. You would like to say that they will do, but they will not, because this becomes their first weapon of choice immediately because they can. And it becomes a weapon of lazy policing, right? And it will just lead to more radicalization, and your moral argument of the states must not behave in the same way that criminals have. So if you see a too good to be true model, you just go, no, those things can't exist. They won't, and here's a reason why. Okay, I think this is enough of me blabbering and we must do a debate.
Okay.
Yeah. How do you want to do this? We can only do two because of venue restrictions.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Keeping on the